Young billionaire finds a girl with two unconscious babies in a winter park and takes them to his mansion. But the next day, he's shocked when 3 police cars pull up at his door. The snow was falling silently as Paul Mason left the restaurant. His business dinner had ended like all the others, with a new contract signed and a lingering emptiness that no success seemed to fill. He adjusted his expensive coat against the bitter December wind and walked toward his car parked at the end of the street. The city of Boston lay under a white blanket of winter. Christmas lights twinkled in the shop windows. But for Paul, it was just another month on the calendar. At 42, he had built a real estate empire, but never a home. His penthouse apartment was as cold as the night around him. As he walked, his phone vibrated. It was Jake, his assistant, with yet another problem to solve. Paul sighed, pocketing the phone. Tomorrow would be soon enough for more work. Then he heard it, a sound so out of place on the deserted street that it stopped him in his tracks. A sob. Low, almost imperceptible, but unmistakable. Paul turned his head, looking for the source. There, in the side alley between 2 buildings, a small figure was crouched against the wall. For a moment, he considered walking on. It wasn't his business. He never got involved. Something made him hesitate. "Are you okay?" he asked, his voice sounding harsher than he intended. No answer, just another muffled sob. Paul took 2 steps toward the alley, annoyed with himself for veering off course. The streetlight partially illuminated the spot, and what he saw left him frozen. A little girl, no more than 5 years old, was huddled there. Her thin coat was covered in snow, her face streaked with frozen tears. But that wasn't what made Paul feel like he'd been punched in the stomach. It was what she was holding. 2 babies wrapped in blankets, motionless against her chest. "My God," he muttered, moving closer quickly. The girl pulled the babies closer, looking at him with wide, fearful eyes. "I'm not going to hurt you," Paul said, crouching down to her level. He realized his heart was pounding. "Where's your mother?" The girl only shook her head, her lips trembling so much she could barely speak. Paul reached out to touch one of the babies, noticing how the skin looked bluish from the cold. "Are they breathing?" She nodded weakly. "But they're really cold." The first aid training Paul had taken years ago, more out of corporate obligation than genuine interest, flashed through his mind. Hypothermia. The babies needed warmth, and fast. "How long have you been out here?" he asked, already removing his coat. Since the sun went away," the girl answered, her voice a whisper. Paul wrapped all 3 of them in his wool coat. "What's your name?" "Lily," she replied, watching him with a mix of distrust and hope. "Lily," he repeated, trying to soften his tone. "I'm Paul. These babies need help, and so do you. Can I take you somewhere warm?" She hesitated, and Paul saw all the warnings she had probably been given about not talking to strangers, battling against her desperate need for help. "My home isn't far," he added. "We can call a doctor for the babies." Fresh tears ran down Lily's dirty face. "Are you going to call the police?" The question caught him off guard. "Are you afraid of the police?" She didn't answer directly, just pulled the babies tighter against her. "They'll separate us." Paul didn't know what to say. The situation was beyond anything he had ever dealt with. His instinct told him to call the authorities right away, but the fear in the girl's eyes made him hesitate. "First, let's take care of the babies," he decided. "We'll figure out the rest after." Lily reluctantly agreed. Paul tried to take one of the babies, but she refused to let them go. "All right," he said, "you can hold them. My car is right there." They walked to the black Audi parked nearby, Paul juggling to keep his coat draped over the 3. He opened the rear door, and Lily slid in, still clutching her precious bundle. As he drove, Paul watched her in the rearview mirror. She looked so small on the leather seat, her eyes never leaving the babies. On her young face, there was a seriousness no child should have to carry. "How old are they?" Paul asked, trying to keep a conversation going. 7 months, Lily replied, her gaze still on the twins. "They're Michael and Sophia. And you?" 5.5. Paul felt a lump in his throat. 5 years old, practically a baby herself, carrying 2 others. "Where's your mom, Lily?" he tried again. The girl remained silent for so long that Paul thought she wouldn't answer. When she finally spoke, her voice was almost inaudible. "She didn't wake up today." Paul felt a chill that had nothing to do with the cold outside. Didn't wake up could mean so many things, none of them good. "What about your dad?" Lily just shook her head. They arrived at Paul's apartment building, a sleek structure with a doorman and security. He parked in his private spot and turned to look at Lily, who now showed clear signs of exhaustion. "We're here. Let's get you inside and looked after." Charles, the doorman, widened his eyes when he saw Paul walking in with a ragged-looking child holding 2 babies. In 15 years working there, he had never seen Mr. Mason with children, much less in a situation like this. "Mr. Mason, is everything all right?" he asked, uncertain. "Yes, Charles. It's an emergency. Please don't mention this to anyone." The man nodded, discreet as always, while pressing the elevator button. During the ride up to the top floor, Lily seemed paler by the minute. One of the babies started making a low, whimpering sound. Paul's apartment took up the entire top floor, with panoramic views of the city. Usually, he was proud of the minimalist space, the expensive but impersonal decor that reflected his lifestyle. Now, seeing it through Lily's eyes, it felt cold and sterile. "Come, let's go to the guest room," he said, guiding her down the wide hallway. In the never-used guest room, he turned the heater on high and helped Lily lay the babies on the king-size bed. Under the bright light, Paul could see how serious it was. The babies were pale, with slightly bluish lips, and their clothes were damp. "We need to warm them and get them out of these wet clothes," he said, more to himself than to Lily. "And call a doctor." He picked up his phone and dialed Dr. Reynolds, his private physician, silently grateful he had an emergency number he had never used. "Dr. Reynolds? Paul Mason. I have an emergency with 2 infants. Possible hypothermia. Can you come immediately?" He gave the address and hung up, turning his attention back to Lily, who looked like she was about to pass out from exhaustion. "He'll be here in 20 minutes. Paul fetched towels from the bathroom and started carefully drying one of the babies. "Sophia, right?" Lily nodded, doing the same for Michael. Her small hands worked with surprising skill, showing it wasn't her first time caring for her siblings. "Are you hungry?" Paul asked, noticing how thin she was under the flimsy coat. She didn't answer, but her stomach growled audibly. "I'll fix you something to eat while we wait for the doctor." In the immaculate and rarely used kitchen, Paul opened the fridge to find little more than bottled water, expensive wine, and leftover Thai food. He picked up the phone again and called the 24-hour delivery service he occasionally used. "I need hot soup, sandwiches, milk, fruit, and what else do kids eat?" he muttered. Realizing how unprepared he was, he completed the order with various items he thought might be useful and requested immediate delivery. When he returned to the room, he found Lily lying next to the babies, her eyes struggling to stay open. "The doctor's almost here," he said softly. "So is the food." She nodded without looking at him, all her attention on the babies. "Please," Lily suddenly whispered, her voice breaking. "Please don't let them separate us." It was as if something inside Paul cracked. That small child, exhausted beyond her limits, still had energy only for that one worry, keeping her family together. "I won't let that happen," he replied, surprising himself with the firmness in his own voice. The doorbell rang 20 minutes later. Dr. Reynolds, a middle-aged man with a stern expression and kind eyes, walked in carrying his medical bag. "Paul, this is unexpected," he remarked, assessing the situation with a professional gaze. "I'll explain later. Please see to the children first." The doctor examined the babies with silent efficiency. Lily watched his every move, tense as a drawn bow. "Mild to moderate hypothermia," he concluded. "They're dehydrated and probably hungry, but they seem to be responding well to the warmth." He looked at Paul. "They're lucky you found them. A few more hours in that cold—" He didn't need to finish the sentence. Paul shuddered at the thought of what might have happened had he chosen to leave the restaurant by a different door. "And her?" Paul asked, nodding toward Lily. The doctor turned his attention to the girl, who allowed the examination reluctantly, her eyes never leaving the babies. Exhausted, malnourished, mild hypothermia, but surprisingly well given the circumstances. He lowered his voice. "Paul, I need to know what's going on here. These children need to be in a hospital." Before Paul could answer, the doorbell rang again. The food delivery. While Paul paid and took the bags, he thought about what to tell the doctor. The truth was, he himself didn't know what was going on, or why he felt an inexplicable need to protect these 3 children he barely knew. He returned to the room with the food to find Lily asleep beside the babies, who now looked slightly better. Dr. Reynolds was preparing 2 small syringes, vitamins and a mild rehydration solution, he explained. "It's nothing invasive, but it will help." After administering the injections to the babies, who didn't even wake, the doctor turned to Paul. "Now, tell me what's happening." Paul explained how he had found the children, omitting only Lily's comment about her mother not waking up. Something in him wanted to protect that information until he knew more about the situation. "They need proper medical attention, Paul," insisted the doctor. "A shelter, social services—" "No," Paul interrupted, startling himself. "They stay here tonight. Tomorrow morning, I'll decide what to do." Dr. Reynolds studied him for a long moment. "This isn't like you, Paul." "I know. You have no experience with children." "I know that too. There will be legal consequences if you don't report this immediately." Paul ran a hand through his hair, feeling completely out of his depth. "I just need one night to think." After a moment of hesitation, the doctor sighed. "I'll leave some medication and instructions. I'll come back in the morning to check on them. Until then—" He gave Paul a meaningful look. "Think carefully about what you're doing." After the doctor left, Paul returned to the room. Lily was sleeping soundly, one arm protectively over her siblings. For a moment, he just watched that small makeshift family in his guest bed. Never in his adult life had Paul felt responsible for anyone but himself. Relationships were fleeting, friendships superficial, and family was a distant concept since his parents died more than a decade ago. Now, looking at those 3 vulnerable children, he felt the weight of something entirely new, a protective instinct so strong it scared him. "What are you getting yourself into, Mason?" he muttered to himself. One of the babies, Michael, he presumed, briefly opened his eyes, meeting Paul's gaze for an instant before drifting back to sleep. It was a look without judgment, without expectations, only pure trust and absolute vulnerability. Paul picked up an extra blanket and carefully covered Lily. The girl didn't even stir, too exhausted to dream. "Please don't let them separate us." Her words echoed in his mind as he slipped quietly out of the room. It wasn't a rational decision, certainly not one the Paul of yesterday would have made. But at that moment, he knew he would do whatever it took to keep that promise. What it meant, or how it would change his life, were questions for daylight. Paul woke to the insistent sound of the doorbell. He blinked in confusion, trying to gather his thoughts. The clock on the bedside table read 7:23 a.m. He'd slept less than 4 hours since finally settling on the sofa, after several trips to the guest room during the night to check on the children. The doorbell rang again, this time accompanied by firm knocks. Paul threw on a robe over his pajamas and crossed the apartment, rubbing his face to shake off the sleep. When he opened the door, his heart skipped a beat. 3 uniformed police officers stood in the hallway, faces serious and posture rigid. Behind them was a middle-aged woman in a grey blazer holding a folder. "Mr. Paul Mason?" asked the older officer, a broad-shouldered man with grey at the temples. "Yes, that's me." Paul felt his throat go dry. Somehow, he knew this visit had everything to do with the 3 children sleeping in his guest room. "I'm Detective Harris. These are Officers Ramirez and Collins." He pointed to the other two officers. "And this is Mrs. Warner from Child Protective Services. May we come in?" Paul hesitated only for a second before stepping aside. "Of course." As they entered, Paul tried to remain calm. He hadn't done anything wrong, technically. He'd found children in danger and helped them. He'd called a doctor. He always intended to contact the authorities, eventually. "Mr. Mason, Mrs. Warner began as soon as they reached the living room. "We received information that you may have 3 children in your residence, Lily, Michael, and Sophia Campbell." "How do you know that?" Paul asked, trying to buy time to think. Detective Harris intervened. "Your doctor, Dr. Reynolds, contacted us this morning. He was concerned about the children's welfare." Paul felt a stab of betrayal, but knew the doctor had done what he believed was right. "The children are fine," Paul assured them. "They're sleeping in the guest room. I found them last night in an alley near Marino's restaurant. They were cold, the babies nearly unconscious. I couldn't just leave them there." "We understand your concern, Mr. Mason," Mrs. Warner said, her tone professional but not hostile. "But you should have contacted the authorities immediately." "I thought the priority was medical attention," Paul replied, surprised at the firmness in his voice. After that, they were exhausted. It didn't seem right to disturb them in the middle of the night. Detective Harris exchanged a look with the social worker before continuing. "Mr. Mason, I have some difficult information to share. We found the children's mother, Sophie Campbell. She was located deceased in an apartment in the south end of the city this morning." Paul felt as if the floor had fallen from beneath him, so Lily was right. Her mother really hadn't woken up. "What was the cause?" he asked, his voice barely a whisper. "It's still under investigation," the detective replied cautiously. "But there are indications it may not have been a natural death. The apartment was ransacked." Paul closed his eyes for a moment, absorbing the information. A mother dead under suspicious circumstances. 3 children left in the cold. It was a complete tragedy. "Do the kids know?" he asked. "That's why we're here." Mrs. Warner stepped forward. "We need to take the children to a temporary shelter until we can locate other relatives." "A shelter?" Paul repeated, alarmed. They just went through a trauma. Separating the 3 of them now would only make things worse. "I understand your concern," the woman said, her voice softening slightly. "But there are protocols we have to follow. And frankly, Mr. Mason, you have no legal relation to these children." Before Paul could respond, a small noise came from the hallway. They all turned to see Lily standing in the doorway, barefoot and disheveled. Her eyes flickered over the uniformed strangers before settling on Paul. "Lily," Paul said gently, "are you all right? Are the babies still sleeping?" She nodded, not taking her eyes off the visitors. "Who are they?" "They're police officers," Paul explained, choosing honesty, "and this lady works to help children." Lily's face went pale. It was obvious she understood the implications. Her small shoulders stiffened. Mrs. Warner approached, crouching to the child's level. "Hello, Lily. My name is Patricia. I'm here to help you and your little brother and sister." "We don't need help," Lily said quickly. "Paul is taking care of us." "Lily," the woman continued in a gentle voice, "we need to talk about your mom." The girl stepped back. "She didn't wake up," she said quietly. "I tried everything. I shook her, yelled at her. I even threw water on her, like she did when I wouldn't wake up for school." Her voice broke, but she stayed cold and didn't move. Paul felt his heart clench. The image of that small child desperately trying to wake her mother was devastating. "Oh, sweetie," Mrs. Warner said, extending her hand, but Lily pulled away. "Paul said we could stay," Lily insisted, her voice rising. "He said he wouldn't separate us." Detective Harris shot Paul an accusatory look, which he ignored, focusing on Lily. "Lily, why did you leave home with the babies?" Paul asked gently. "Because they were going to come," she replied, glancing nervously at the police officers. "Mommy always said if something happened to her, I had to grab the babies and run. Go somewhere busy and find someone who looked trustworthy. The adults in the room exchanged worried looks. Who was going to come, Lily? Detective Harris asked, his voice much softer now. Lily shook her head violently. I can't say. Mommy said it was a secret. A soft cry came from the guest room, breaking the tension. Lily immediately turned to go to the babies, but Mrs. Warner gently held her arm. I'll go with you, sweetheart. Lily looked at Paul, clearly panicking. Paul, you promised. Let her go, Paul told the social worker firmly. She takes care of them better than any of us could. After a moment of hesitation, Mrs. Warner nodded, and Lily ran to the bedroom. As soon as the girl left, Detective Harris turned to Paul. What exactly did you promise her? That I wouldn't let them separate, Paul answered honestly. I didn't know the scope of the situation at the time, but now more than ever I see it was the right promise. She's terrified, and trusting adults clearly isn't easy for her. Mr. Mason, Mrs. Warner intervened, I understand your concern, but you have no blood relationship with these children, nor any qualification to care for them. Our priority is to ensure their safety, and taking them to a shelter, splitting them up after they just lost their mother, ensures that safety, Paul retorted, feeling an unexpected anger rise in him. Lily is only 5 years old and is already taking responsibility for her siblings. The last thing she needs is to be separated from them. We can't just leave 3 children with a stranger, Mrs. Warner argued, losing some of her professional composure. What if I offer to be a temporary guardian? Paul suggested, the words spilling out before he could think them through. Silence fell. The 3 visitors looked at him as if he'd suggested something absurd. Mr. Mason, Detective Harris finally spoke, being the guardian of 3 children, 2 of them infants, isn't like acquiring property. It requires commitment, training, evaluations. I'm aware, Paul interrupted, and I'm willing to go through any necessary process. In the meantime, I can hire nurses, nannies, any professional help required. Why? Mrs. Warner asked, genuinely curious. Why get involved like this? Paul hesitated. It was a valid question. Why was he, a man who had always lived solely for himself, suddenly willing to turn his life upside down for 3 children he barely knew? Because I promised, he finally said, and because these kids have already lost everything. I can't just turn my back. Before anyone could respond, Lily returned to the living room carrying Sophia while Michael still cried in the bedroom. They're hungry, she said to Paul, ignoring the other adults, and need changing. Paul nodded and took a step toward the bedroom, but the social worker intervened. Let me help, Lily. It's my job to care for children. But Lily shook her head, holding Sophia even tighter. No. Paul helps. Detective Harris sighed. Look, there's clearly a connection here we can't ignore. Mr. Mason, why don't you handle the babies with Lily while we speak privately with Mrs. Warner? Paul nodded, grateful for the opportunity. He and Lily went back to the guest room, where Michael was still crying in his makeshift pillow nest. I brought some supplies for the babies last night, Paul said, showing Lily the diapers, wipes, and formula he had ordered. Think you can show me how to do this right? The girl nodded, placing Sophia beside her brother and taking charge with a competence that broke Paul's heart. A 5-year-old shouldn't be this skilled in infant care. As they worked together to change and feed the twins, Paul noticed Lily glancing nervously at the door. They're going to take us away, aren't they? She finally asked, her small voice trembling. Paul took a deep breath. I'm doing everything I can so you can stay here, Lily. I promise. But you're not family. The observation was simple, but precise. No, I'm not, Paul agreed. But that doesn't mean I can't take care of you. Lily looked at him for a long moment, as if deciding whether she could really trust this adult. Why? Why do you want us to stay? The question caught him off guard, just like it had when Mrs. Warner asked. But with Lily, the answer came more easily, Because you were very brave last night, Lily. You saved your siblings. And now, I want to help save all three of you. Her eyes shone with unshed tears, but she just nodded and turned her attention back to Sophia, checking if the bottle was positioned correctly. When they returned to the living room, Paul immediately sensed that something had changed. Detective Harris seemed less stern, and Mrs. Warner was regarding him with a thoughtful expression. "Mr. Mason," she began, "given these unusual circumstances, we are willing to consider a temporary arrangement, with conditions." Paul felt cautious relief. "What conditions?" "First, you'll need to undergo a full background check and an urgent home assessment," she explained. "Second, you'll need to hire professional help for childcare. Third, there will be frequent follow-up visits." "Understood," Paul agreed immediately. "And," she continued, "this is only temporary, while we look for other relatives of the children. If there are any willing and qualified family members, the children will be placed in their care." Paul nodded, though he felt a strange resistance to the idea. He told himself it was normal. The children would be better off with relatives, after all. Still, a protective feeling he'd never experienced before stirred in his chest. "There's one more thing," Detective Harris said. "We need you and Lily to come down to the station today. We need formal statements, and in Lily's case, we need to learn more about her home situation and any information she might have about the circumstances of her mother's death." "She's just a child," Paul protested. "A child who may have vital information," the detective responded firmly. "We'll handle it as gently and professionally as possible, with child psychologists present." Paul looked at Lily, who was cuddling Sophia as if her life depended on it. "What about the babies?" "They can come too," Mrs. Warner said. "We have a suitable children's room at the station." After all the details were settled, the group prepared to leave. While Paul helped Lily into the coats he'd bought for the three of them the previous night, a thought struck him. "I need to make a call before we go," he told the officers. Going into his office, Paul dialed a number he rarely used but kept for emergencies. After 3 rings, a deep voice answered. "Richard Barnes." "Rick, it's Paul Mason. I need a favor." Richard Barnes was the best family lawyer in the city, and coincidentally, owed Paul a huge favor for an investment that had saved him from bankruptcy years ago. "Paul, this is unexpected. What can I do for you?" "I need legal help to get temporary custody of 3 children. It's urgent." There was a pause on the other end. "That's very unlike you, Paul. I'm aware. I'm heading to the central precinct now. I need you to meet me there as soon as possible." "I'll be there in 20 minutes, Richard promised, asking no more questions, a quality Paul had always appreciated in him. When Paul returned to the living room, he found Lily sitting stiffly on the sofa, holding Michael while Mrs. Warner adjusted Sophia's coat. The distrust on the girl's face was palpable. "Ready to go, Lily?" Paul asked gently. She looked at him, her eyes pleading. "Will we come back here after?" Paul knelt to her level. "That's what I'm trying to make sure of. My lawyer friend is meeting us at the station to help." "A lawyer?" she asked, frowning. "Someone who understands the law and can help us stay together," Paul explained. Lily seemed to consider this for a moment, then, to everyone's surprise, handed Michael to Paul. It was a small gesture, but Paul understood its meaning, a beginning of trust. In the elevator, heading down to the lobby where the police cars were waiting, Paul felt the weight of the responsibility he was taking on. 24 hours ago, his biggest concern was closing a new real estate deal. Now, he was about to fight for custody of 3 orphaned children. As they got into the police cruiser, Paul insisted on going in the same vehicle as Lily and the babies. He noticed the girl's expression shift between worry and a timid flicker of hope. "It'll be all right," he said, though he wasn't sure how he could guarantee it. Lily didn't reply, but as the car started moving, she slid her small hand into Paul's. It was a simple gesture, but it carried enormous meaning. A child who had lost everything was willing to trust him, at least a little. Paul gently squeezed that tiny hand, silently sealing a promise he never imagined making. "I won't let them separate us," he murmured, low enough that only Lily could hear. She nodded almost imperceptibly, her eyes fixed on the city passing by the car window, a city that, until yesterday, had never seemed so threatening to Paul Mason. Paul woke to the shrill sound of his cell phone alarm. Still in the dark, his hand groped the bedside table until he found the device and turned it off. 5 in the morning. He groaned, rolling over in bed. Before it, he'd easily sleep until 7 on non-meeting days. Now he needed the extra time to organize the day ahead. 2 weeks had passed since the children entered his life. 2 weeks of a transformation so radical in his routine that sometimes he barely recognized his own existence. He dragged himself out of bed and headed straight for the shower. The hot water helped clear his mind as he mentally went over the day's schedule. Feed the twins at 6 a.m., prepare Lily's breakfast at 7 a.m., video conference with investors at 8:30 a.m., pediatric checkup for the babies at 11 a.m. His apartment, once a minimalist and organized space, now looked like a war zone. Bottles, diapers, toys, and tiny clothes covered every available surface. The fridge, once filled only with leftovers from upscale restaurants and imported drinks, now held rows of milk, juice, and baby food jars. Paul finished dressing and walked quietly down the hallway. He stopped first at what was now Lily's room, the former guest room, hastily redecorated in shades of purple and green, her favorite colors. The girl was fast asleep, clutching the teddy bear he'd bought on the second day. Her brown hair fanned out on the pillow, forming a contrast with her fair skin. She looked so small and fragile there. Next door, he went to the room next door, which had been his home office and now housed the twins. 2 identical cribs, a white dresser, a comfortable armchair for nighttime feedings, and a colorful alphabet rug. Michael was awake, staring intently at the mobile hanging over his crib. When he saw Paul, he gave a toothless grin that warmed Paul's heart in a way he couldn't explain. "Good morning, buddy," Paul whispered, picking the baby up. "Let's let your sister sleep a bit longer, okay?" In the kitchen, with Michael settled in his high chair, Paul prepared the bottle with the skill of someone who'd been doing it for years, not just a couple of weeks. At first, he'd been clumsy, spilling milk, getting the temperature wrong, dropping utensils. Now, his movements were as precise as a well-rehearsed dance. While feeding the baby, his phone vibrated. A message from Claudia, the third nanny he'd tried hiring in that fortnight. "Mr. Mason, I'm sorry to say I can't continue. Lily refuses to let me care for the babies, and honestly, the situation is very stressful." "I wish you luck," Paul sighed, setting the phone aside. It was no surprise. The 2 previous nannies had also quit after just a few days. Lily simply didn't trust strangers near her siblings. She'd follow the nannies around the house, correcting their every move. And when they weren't looking, she'd pick up the babies and take them to Paul, insisting they weren't being cared for properly. The result was that Paul now spent far more time at home. His meetings, formerly in person and often extended by business dinners, were mostly held by video conference. His home office had moved to a corner of the living room, where he could work while keeping an eye on the children. "We'll have to find another solution," he muttered to Michael, who sucked contentedly on his bottle. The baby just stared back with curious, trusting eyes. Sophia started crying then, the sound coming through the baby monitor on the counter. Paul finished feeding Michael, placed him back in the high chair, and hurried to get the little one. He was changing Sophia's diaper when Lily appeared in the doorway, rubbing her eyes. "You're doing it wrong," she said, stepping closer. "You have to wipe like this." She demonstrated the correct motion with a wet wipe. Paul nodded, following her instructions. He'd quickly learned that Lily, at 5 years old, knew more about caring for babies than he ever imagined. Rather than argue, he welcomed her tips. "Thank you, teacher," he smiled. "Want some breakfast? I can make pancakes." Her eyes lit up for a moment before returning to her usual caution. "Okay." While Paul prepared breakfast with Sophia in his arms and Michael watching from the high chair, Lily sat at the counter, swinging her legs. Her socks had unicorn prints, a gift Paul had bought the week before. Seeing those small legs swinging freely, with bright socks instead of the tense, guarded posture of her first days, gave Paul a sense of progress. "We have to go to the doctor today," he said casually, flipping a pancake in the air, which earned a small smile from Lily. "The babies need their vaccinations." Lily immediately went serious. "I'm coming too." "Of course," Paul agreed. There was no longer any debate about that. Lily never let the twins out of her sight, and he'd accepted that condition. "And after?" she asked. "After that, I need to work a bit. I have an important video meeting. Think you can help with the babies while I talk to some people?" She nodded solemnly, as though given an important mission. Paul's phone rang again. It was Richard Barnes, his lawyer. "1 minute, Lily," he said, answering the call while serving pancakes to the girl. "Richard, good morning." "Paul, sorry for the early call, but I need to speak with you. I have news about Sophie Campbell." Paul stepped away a bit, lowering his voice. "Go ahead." "Not over the phone. Can we meet today? It's important." Paul glanced at the children. Going anywhere with the three was always a logistical operation. "I have a pediatric appointment at 11. We can meet at the cafe near the clinic around 12:30. "Perfect. And Paul, you'd better come alone. What I have to say isn't for the kids' ears." The call ended, leaving Paul with a sense of apprehension. Richard wasn't one to dramatize. If he said it was important, it probably was. The rest of the morning passed in the new chaotic routine. Paul tried dressing the babies while Lily criticized his clothing choices. "No, it's cold out there. Sophia needs socks." Grabbed the vaccines he'd kept in the fridge, found the bag with diapers and wipes, and tried to remember where he'd left his car keys. In the elevator, Mrs. Peterson from the 3rd floor looked at him with a mix of surprise and admiration. "Mr. Mason, I never imagined seeing you like this," she remarked, observing Paul with a baby in each arm and Lily clutching his jacket. "Neither did I, Mrs. Peterson," he laughed. "Neither did I." At the pediatric clinic, Paul felt out of place. He was the only man in the waiting room, surrounded by experienced mothers who seemed to know exactly what to do. He tried to keep Sophia calm while Michael tugged at his hair, and Lily nervously flipped through a children's book. "The Mason family," the receptionist called. Paul had never been called that before. "The Mason family." It sounded strange, almost surreal, but somehow not entirely unpleasant. The consultation was quick and efficient. Dr. Rodriguez, a pediatrician recommended by Mrs. Warner from social services, examined the babies with professional care while patiently answering all of Lily's anxious questions. "They're developing very well, Mr. Mason," the doctor concluded. "Considering everything they've been through, they're surprisingly healthy." "Because I took good care of them," Lily said proudly. The doctor smiled, nodding. "No doubt you did a great job, Lily." Then, turning to Paul, she lowered her voice. "Mr. Mason, I noticed how attached Lily is to her siblings." "More than attached," Paul confirmed. "She practically won't let anyone touch them." "It's understandable, given the trauma she's faced, but maybe consider some psychological support. I have an excellent colleague who works with children who've experienced loss." Paul nodded, mentally adding another task to his growing list. After the checkup, Paul took the kids back to the car, strapped them into their safety seats, and checked the time. Noon. He needed to meet Richard in half an hour, but how to do that with 3 kids? The solution came unexpectedly. Sarah, his executive assistant of many years, called to confirm details of the afternoon's video conference. "Sarah," he said, an idea forming, "could you do me a huge personal favor? I'm with the kids downtown near Dr. Miller's clinic, and I need to meet with Richard Barnes. Could you stay with them in the car for half an hour? I'll only be a few steps away at the cafe on the corner." There was a pause on the other line. In 6 years of working together, Paul had never asked Sarah for a personal favor. "Of course, Mr. Mason, I'm 10 minutes away." When Sarah arrived, Paul made the introductions. "Lily, this is Sarah, my assistant." She'll stay with you in the car while I have a quick chat with my lawyer at that cafe. You can see me from here. I'll be at the window table." He expected resistance, but to his surprise, Lily simply studied Sarah carefully before nodding. "You'll come back soon?" she asked, her voice small. "I promise." 30 minutes, Muk Topse. At the cafe, Richard Barnes was already waiting, a thick folder on the table before him. The lawyer, normally immaculate in his expensive suits, looked tired, with slight worry lines around his eyes. "Thanks for coming," he said when Paul sat down. "How are the kids?" "Surprisingly fine, considering everything. Lily still doesn't trust anyone with the babies, making it almost impossible to hire help." Richard nodded sympathetically. "And how are you coping?" Paul considered the question. How was he coping? His once uninterrupted nights of sleep were gone. His tidy apartment had become chaos. His work schedule had to be completely restructured. And yet, "I'm okay," he answered honestly. "Better than I expected." "Good, because what I have to tell you will complicate things even more." Richard opened the folder and slid some papers toward Paul. "I hired a private investigator to find out more about Sophie Campbell. What he found is concerning." Paul examined the documents. There were copies of employment records, bank statements, and a list of residences showing Sophie had moved 6 times in the last 3 years. "She was on the run," Paul concluded. "Exactly, and not just randomly changing addresses. She followed a specific pattern, always moving farther away from Denver to Colorado. That's where she last lived before she began moving constantly." "What happened in Denver?" Richard slid over another document, a newspaper clipping. The headline read, "Local businessman investigated for drug trafficking. No formal charges due to lack of evidence. Victor Delgado." Richard pointed to the name in the article. "A respectable businessman on the surface, a criminal underneath. And according to our investigator, Sophie Campbell's ex-partner and the biological father of the twins." Paul felt a chill run down his spine. "Is he looking for the kids?" "That's our fear. Sophie worked as a receptionist at one of Delgado's companies. They had a relationship. She got pregnant. But at some point, Sophie discovered something that made her grab Lily, who was only 3 at the time, and flee just before giving birth to the twins." "Did she testify against him?" Richard shook his head. "Not officially, but our investigator spoke to a detective in Denver who confirmed Sophie had reached out saying she had information. Before she could formally report anything, she disappeared from the city. And now she's dead," Paul concluded, the weight of the situation settling over him. "The police initially ruled it an accidental overdose," Richard went on, "but our investigator found inconsistencies. The apartment was ransacked in a way that suggests someone was searching, not just typical disarray. And most concerning, Sophie's laptop and phone disappeared. You're suggesting she was murdered?" Richard didn't answer directly. "I'm suggesting there's more to this story than meets the eye, and that the children may be in danger." Paul glanced out the window, spotting his car across the street. He could see Sarah in the driver's seat, and the top of Lily's head in the back. 3 innocent children possibly at the center of something much bigger and more dangerous than he'd ever imagined. "What should I do?" he asked, feeling the weight of responsibility grow exponentially. "For now, nothing different. Keep caring for them. Maintain your routine. I've passed this information to Detective Harris, who's reopening the investigation into Sophie's death. As for your legal situation with the kids, the preliminary custody hearing is scheduled for next week. What about this Delgado? So far, there's no indication he knows where the children are, but if he is looking..." Richard let the sentence hang. Paul thought of Lily, how she said her mother had told her to take the babies and run if anything happened. Sophie knew they were in danger. She knew someone might come after them. "I need to protect them," Paul said, his resolve now far beyond fulfilling an impulsive promise. "Are you sure you want to continue with this, Paul?" Richard asked seriously. "You can always back out. Let the system take care of the kids. It would be safer for you." The question made Paul reflect, 2 weeks ago, he probably would have taken the easy way out, returned to his orderly, predictable life and comfortable solitude. But now the thought of abandoning the children was unbearable. He remembered the previous night, when Sophia had colic and only fell asleep after hours of rocking in his arms. Michael's trusting gaze whenever he walked into the room. Lily's genuine smiles directed at him, even if still occasionally guarded. "I can't back out," he finally replied. "Not now." Richard studied his friend for a moment, as though seeing him under a new light. "You know, when you first called me that day, I thought this was just another one of your eccentric projects. But this is different, isn't it?" Paul nodded, surprised by the emotion he felt. "They need me." The lawyer gathered the documents, placing them back into the folder. "And it seems you need them too." Walking back to the car, Paul felt the weight of Richard's revelations. It wasn't just about caring for 3 orphans, it was about protecting them from a potentially lethal threat. As he approached the vehicle, Lily rolled the window down, her face anxious. "You took forever." "Sorry," Paul smiled, trying not to show his concern. "Grown-up stuff." He got into the car, thanked Sarah, who left to catch a cab back to the office, and sat for a moment, just watching the children in the rearview mirror. Michael played happily with a teething toy. Sophia slept peacefully. Lily looked out the window, vigilant as always. "You okay, Lily?" he asked. She turned to him, her eyes showing a wisdom beyond her years. "That man, did he talk about Mommy?" Paul hesitated. "Yes, we talked a bit about her. She's not coming back, is she?" The question was simple, but heavy with pain. "No, honey, she's not coming back," Lily nodded, as if confirming something she already knew. "So it's just the 4 of us now?" The question struck a chord within Paul. The 4 of us, a unit. An improvised family, forged in the most unlikely circumstances. "Yes, Lily, it's just the 4 of us now." As he drove home, with 3 precious lives entrusted to his care, Paul knew he was in the midst of something far greater than he'd ever imagined. Bigger than million-dollar contracts, bigger than business success. And surprisingly, it was exactly where he wanted to be. The rain was coming down hard outside when Paul found Lily sitting alone in the living room. It was almost midnight, and he had just checked on the twins, who were sound asleep in their cribs. Normally, by this time, Lily would also be asleep. "Can't sleep?" he asked softly, sitting beside her on the couch. Lily shook her head, hugging her knees to her chest. She was wearing unicorn pajamas Paul had bought the previous week. Her hair was down, framing her small face, which, under the soft lamplight, looked even younger and more vulnerable. "I had a dream about Mommy," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. Paul waited, giving her space to continue if she wanted. In the past few days, he'd learned that pushing Lily only made her withdraw. "She was singing to me," Lily went on, "that same song I sing to Sophia so she can sleep." "It's a pretty song," Paul commented. He had heard Lily sing it many times to the twins. A simple, sweet melody. Lily was quiet for a moment, just watching the rain outside the window. Then, without warning, she said, "My mum wasn't a bad person." The statement caught Paul by surprise. "Of course not, Lily. I never thought she was. The kids at school sometimes said things. They said my mum was," she hesitated, looking for the word, "irresponsible. Because we moved a lot." Paul felt a pang in his chest. Of course Lily heard things, sensed the looks, caught the whispered remarks. "We moved because we had to stay safe," Lily continued, now looking directly at Paul. "Mommy said it was like a secret mission, only we knew the truth." Paul nodded, trying not to show the alarm he felt. "What was the truth, Lily?" The girl took a deep breath as though gathering courage. "That the bad man couldn't find us. He was the twins' father, but he wasn't a good father. Mommy said he did bad things, hurt people." Paul remembered what Richard had said about Victor Delgado, the criminal disguised as a respectable businessman. "She tried to tell the police," Lily continued, "but no one believed her. So we had to run away. That must have been really hard for you, Paul said softly. Lily nodded. Mommy cried at night when she thought I was asleep, but during the day she always smiled. She said we had to be strong, like superheroes. A small smile appeared on her face. She called me Captain Courageous. Paul felt his eyes welling up. The image of Sophie, fighting alone to protect her children, smiling despite her fear, was heartbreaking. When the babies were born, it got harder, Lily went on. Mommy had to work a lot, and I took care of them. She taught me everything about bottles and diapers. Pride colored her voice. She said I was the best helper in the world. I'm sure you were, Paul smiled. You still take great care of them. Lily looked at her hands. In the last place we lived, I thought we were going to stay. Mommy seemed happy. She worked at a restaurant for almost 6 months. I even had a friend at school. Her voice faltered. But then Mommy got scared again. She said she saw someone she recognized, someone who worked for him. So you moved here, Paul concluded. It was really fast. We left at night, just one suitcase. Mommy was so nervous. When we got here, she said it would be the last time, that we'd be safe here. Lily raised her eyes, filled with tears. But we weren't. Without thinking, Paul opened his arms, and to his surprise, Lily came to him, allowing herself to be held. It was the first time she'd accepted this kind of contact on her own. I just wish she was still here, Lily sobbed against his chest. I know, Paul whispered, feeling his heart break for this child's pain. I know, sweetheart. For several minutes, they stayed like that, only the sound of the rain and Lily's soft sobs filling the silence. Paul felt her weight in his arms, her trust in him, letting herself be just a child, at least for a moment. When she finally calmed down, she pulled away slightly to look him in the eye. You're going to take care of us now? The question was simple but carried the weight of the world. Paul saw in her eyes all the courage, strength, and fragility of a child who had faced more than anyone ever should. I'll take care of you, Lily, he answered with a certainty that came from deep inside. I promise. She studied him for a moment, as though evaluating the sincerity of his words. Then, with a seriousness that didn't match her 5-year-old face, she said, I think Mommy would have liked you. It was as if something inside Paul cracked wide open. That innocent approval from a child who had lost everything meant more to him than any professional accolade he'd ever received. In that moment, under the dim light of the living room, with the rain pouring outside and a little girl entrusting him with her story and her heart, Paul understood an essential truth. He wasn't just protecting 3 children from a distant threat. He was building a home, a place where Lily could just be a child, where the twins could grow in safety, where they could all belong. When Lily finally fell asleep in his arms, Paul carried her gently to her room. He laid her on the bed, covered her with the starry blanket she loved, and watched her for a moment. Good night, Captain Courageous, he whispered, then slipped out quietly. What are you getting yourself into, Mason? He asked himself again, returning to the silent corridor. Richard Barnes's office was quiet that Sunday afternoon. Only the gentle hum of the air conditioning broke the silence as Paul watched Detective Carter display photos on a tablet. He arrived in Boston 3 days ago, said Carter, a lean man with graying hair whom Richard had hired to investigate the case. He's staying at the Four Seasons with 2 men who appear to be security. Paul looked at the photo. Victor Delgado looked exactly as he imagined. Tall, well-dressed, with the kind of smile that never reached his eyes. The twins' biological father. How did he find out where the kids were? Paul asked, feeling a shiver run down his spine. Carter swiped to the next photo, Delgado speaking with a suited man outside the Department of Child Protective Services. He has connections, Carter explained, and resources. He obtained access to the case records and discovered the children were under temporary guardianship. He paused before continuing. Your name is in the files, Mr. Mason. He knows you have them. Richard, who had been silent until then, clasped his hands on the desk. Has he made any legal moves? Not officially yet, Carter replied. But my contact at the courthouse said his lawyers are preparing a custody petition. He has a strong argument. He's the twins' biological father. What about Lily? Paul asked quickly. Technically, he has no relation to her, but the system usually tries to keep siblings together. If he gets custody of the twins, Lily goes with them, Richard finished grimly. Paul stood up, unable to remain seated. In the past few weeks, his life had changed completely. The previously impersonal apartment was now full of life, scattered with toys, filled with children's laughter, and, yes, tears and challenges too. But the idea of handing the children over to a man Sophie had feared enough to keep running was unthinkable. "What's his criminal record?" Paul asked. "That's the problem," Carter replied, flipping through more photos. "On paper, he's clean. Every investigation against him has been dropped due to lack of evidence. The man is clever, has friends in the system, and gets rid of witnesses either by paying them off or—" He didn't complete the sentence, but the implication was clear. "Like Sophie," Paul concluded. "That's what we suspect, but we can't prove it," Carter agreed. "Her case was reopened, but without new evidence, it remains classified as an accidental overdose." Richard gave Paul a serious look. "We need to be realistic, Paul. Legally, he's in a strong position. He's the biological father, with no convictions, with financial resources." "And he's a criminal," Paul said through clenched teeth. "One who's never been convicted," Richard added. "In the eyes of the law, he's just a father wanting his children back. And you—" He hesitated. "I'm what?" Paul challenged. "A temporary guardian with no blood ties, no prior experience with children, and a professional life that's not exactly suited to raising 3 young kids." The words stung, but Paul knew they were true. His life had once revolved around business, constant travel, late meetings. He'd rearranged everything in recent weeks, but any social worker could question how long this new arrangement would last. "So what do you recommend I do?" Paul asked, trying to keep his voice steady. Richard sighed. "We have some options. We can fight, of course. Present your custody case, challenge Delgado's fitness as a father, but it'll be a tough and expensive battle. Another option," he hesitated again. "Tell me," Paul insisted, "would be letting the system handle the kids. With Sophie's suspicious death and the investigations around Delgado, we might convince the judge to keep them in foster care until everything is clarified. It's not ideal, but it would prevent them from going straight to him." Paul closed his eyes for a moment, imagining Lily and the twins in a shelter or separated in different foster homes. After all they'd been through, after the trust Lily had begun to place in him. "I can't do that to them," he finally said. "I have to fight." Carter cleared his throat. "There's one more thing you should know, Mr. Mason. Delgado isn't the type to give up easily. If you decide to stand in his way, this won't just be a legal battle." "Is that a threat?" "It's a warning," Carter corrected. "I've seen what happens to people who get in his way." Sophie Campbell learned the hard way. Silence weighed on the room as Paul absorbed the gravity of the situation. It wasn't just a custody dispute. It could literally be life or death. "I need to think," he said at last. "Talk to Mrs. Warner at Social Services. Get a better sense of my chances." "That's wise," Richard agreed, "but don't take too long. Delgado's already in motion." On the drive home, Paul's mind whirled with questions. What was best for the kids? Fight, knowing it was a long shot and the risk was high, or accept that maybe the system, flawed as it was their safer option? He arrived at the apartment in the early evening. Grace, the new nanny whom Lily had finally accepted, mainly because she resembled Sophie a bit, was in the living room playing with the twins while Lily drew at the kitchen table. "How did it go?" Paul tried to sound casual. "Just fine," Grace smiled. "The babies ate all their carrot puree, and Lily was a wonderful helper as always." Lily lifted her eyes from her drawing, studying Paul intently. Ever perceptive, she seemed to sense something was off. "Thanks, Grace. I'll take over now." After the nanny left, Paul sat with Lily at the kitchen table, looking at her drawing, a house with 4 stick figures out front. "Is that our family?" he asked gently. Lily nodded without lifting her eyes from the paper. "You, me, Michael, and Sophia." Paul felt a lump in his throat. Family. That's how she saw them now. "Lily," he began, "we need to talk about something." At that moment, his phone rang. It was Mrs. Warner. "Mr. Mason, I need to see you urgently tomorrow. I received a notice about the twins' biological father." Her voice sounded tense. "I'm already aware," Paul said. "What does that mean for the custody process?" Mrs. Warner hesitated. "It's complicated. He has parental rights we must consider. Maybe it's time we discuss alternative options for the children." "What kind of options?" "Temporary foster homes, until the legal situation is sorted out." "Mr. Mason, I know you've grown attached to the children, but you must consider what's best for them in the long run." Paul glanced at Lily, who pretended not to hear the conversation, but whose pencil had stopped moving. "We'll talk tomorrow," he said finally. "Thank you for letting me know." When he hung up, he realized Lily was gone. He found her in the twins' room, standing between the 2 cribs like a small sentry. "Lily?" She turned, and what Paul saw in her eyes destroyed him inside. Fear, pain, and something worse, resignation. "I heard," she said, her voice small, "about the baby's dad, and about sending us away. Lily, it's not exactly like—" Paul tried to explain, stepping closer. "I knew you wouldn't want to keep us," she said, tears brimming in her eyes. "Adults always give up." Her words stabbed Paul like a knife. He knelt in front of her, trying to meet her gaze, but she looked away. "Lily, look at me," he asked gently. "Please." Reluctantly, she lifted her eyes. "I'm not giving up on you," Paul said with a conviction that came straight from his soul. "Never. We're in this together. Even with the bad man trying to take us. Even then, especially because of that." Paul took a deep breath. "I won't lie to you, Lily. It's going to be hard. But I'll fight for you with everything I have." Something changed in her gaze, a faint spark of hope. "Promise?" she whispered. "I promise," Paul said, gently wiping away a tear that rolled down her cheek. "You're my family now. And families stick together." In that moment, looking at this brave child and the 2 sleeping babies, unaware of the danger that threatened them, Paul finally understood the truth his heart had known for weeks. He loved them. Not as a temporary guardian, not as a reluctant protector, but as a father loves his children. And for that love, he would face any threat, even if it came from one of the most dangerous men he'd ever heard of. The Suffolk County Family Court was unusually crowded that morning. Paul adjusted his tie for the 3rd time as he watched people file into the courtroom. His lawyer, Richard Barnes, calmly arranged documents on the table, though Paul noticed the tension in his shoulders. "Nervous?" Richard asked, not looking up from the papers. "Terrified is more like it," Paul replied, glancing at his watch for the 10th time in the last 5 minutes. It had been almost 3 months since he found Lily and the twins on that cold night. 3 months of bottles, diapers, sleepless nights, morning smiles, and a happiness he never imagined feeling. 3 months that had completely transformed his life. And now, it could all end with a single judicial decision. Mrs. Warner from Child Protective Services entered the room, giving Paul a brief nod before taking her seat. She had been surprisingly supportive in recent weeks, especially after seeing the transformation in Paul's apartment, and more importantly, in the children themselves. Lily finally began to act like a normal 5-year-old, and the twins were thriving under constant care. "Where's Lily?" Paul asked, looking anxiously at the door. "Grace has her and the babies in the children's waiting area," Richard replied. "She'll only come in when called to testify." The doors at the back opened, and Paul felt a cold chill as he saw Victor Delgado walk in with his lawyer. Tall, dark, dressed in an impeccable suit, and wearing a confident smile that didn't reach his eyes, he looked precisely like what he was, a predator disguised as a respectable businessman. As their eyes met, Delgado gave Paul a frosty smile, a calculated expression that said, "I've already won." "Ignore him," Richard muttered. That's exactly what he wants. Judge William Collins entered the courtroom, a middle-aged man with a severe expression and sharp eyes. "All rise." The hearing began with formalities, introductions, clarifications about the hearing's purpose, document checks. Paul listened as Richard presented his case. How Paul had found the children in danger, how he created a safe and stable environment for them, how Lily refused to be separated from him, how he'd reorganized his entire life to put the children's needs first. Mr. Mason does not merely have the financial resources to care for these children, Richard concluded. He has the emotional commitment. In less than 3 months, he transformed from a single, career-focused businessman into a dedicated father who puts his children above everything else. This type of commitment, this capacity for change and growth, defines a true guardian. Paul felt a lump in his throat at those words. It was true. He had changed completely. And that change, surprisingly, was the best thing that had ever happened to him. Then it was Martin Green's turn, Delgado's lawyer, an aggressive-looking man in a suit that was too expensive, wearing a disdainful expression. "Your Honor, this case is extremely simple," he began with exaggerated confidence. "My client, Mr. Victor Delgado, is the biological father of Michael and Sophia Campbell. He had no knowledge of his children's existence until recently. The children's mother, now sadly deceased, never informed Mr. Delgado of the pregnancy. As soon as he learned he was the father, he immediately sought his legal rights." Green paced in front of the courtroom as if he had already won the case. "Mr. Delgado is a respected businessman in Denver with no criminal record and ample financial and emotional capacity to raise his children. Any allegations about his character are baseless and slanderous." He looked straight at Paul as he said that. "As for the older child, Lily, though she's not Mr. Delgado's biological daughter, he is generously willing to assume her custody as well, keeping the siblings together. That is an act of pure compassion on his part." Paul had to control the anger rising within him. Compassion. Delgado didn't even know the meaning of the word. "In summary, Your Honor, if we remove the emotional aspect of this case, it becomes clear. A capable, willing biological father has legal priority over a stranger who's known the children for only 3 months. The law is crystal clear on this point." Judge Collins nodded thoughtfully, and Paul felt a chill. It was true that the law generally favored biological ties. "I'd like to hear from Child Protective Services," said the judge, turning to Mrs. Warner. She stood, adjusting her glasses. "Your Honor, we initially had doubts about Mr. Mason's ability to care for 3 small children. However, our home visits over these months have shown impressive adaptation. The home is safe, welcoming, and there are clear emotional bonds between Mr. Mason and the children." She paused. "As for Mr. Delgado, our assessment is more limited since he lives out of state, but his documentation is in order, and there's no formal reason to deny him custody." Paul's heart sank. Even Mrs. Warner-Hewers, who seemed to support him, couldn't ignore the legal facts. The judge flipped through some documents. "I understand that the oldest child, Lily Campbell, has relevant information for this case. I'd like to hear her in private in my chambers." Richard touched Paul's arm. "That's good. It means he wants to protect her from the formal courtroom environment." "What if she's too scared to talk?" Paul worried. "Trust her," Richard replied. "Lily is stronger than she looks." Lily entered the courtroom holding a court assistant's hand. She wore a simple blue dress Paul had bought specifically for this day, her hair styled in 2 braids. She looked even smaller and more vulnerable in the large courtroom. When she saw Paul, her eyes lit up briefly before they landed on Delgado. She froze, clinging to the assistant's hand. Paul wanted to stand, to go to her, protect her, but Richard held his arm. "Let the judge handle it." Judge Collins left the bench and approached Lily, speaking gently. "Hello, Lily. I'm Judge Collins. Would you like to talk to me in my office? It's much more comfortable than here." Lily glanced at Paul for confirmation. He nodded encouragingly, and she finally agreed with a small nod. The minutes that followed were the longest of Paul's life. What was Lily telling him? Could she express what she felt? When they finally returned, the judge looked thoughtful. Lily was taken back to the waiting room, casting one last worried look at Paul. After hearing the minor's testimony, the judge said, "I'd like to proceed with closing arguments. Mr. Barnes, please." Richard rose again, this time with renewed energy. "Your Honor, this case goes beyond legal questions of biological ties. It's about the children's welfare, safety, and emotional stability. Lily Campbell has made it clear on multiple occasions that she sees Mr. Mason as her family now. The twins are flourishing under his care. The question is not who has the best legal argument, but what is best for these children." Delgado's lawyer also gave his closing remarks, reiterating the arguments about biological rights and hinting that Paul's attachment to the children was hasty and possibly pathological. The judge listened carefully to both sides before announcing, "I will need time to consider all aspects of this complex case. We will take a 1-hour recess." As the courtroom cleared, Paul felt a knot in his stomach. The judge's expression offered no clue which way he was leaning. "He seems to be favoring Delgado, doesn't he?" Paul asked Richard quietly as they headed outside. Richard hesitated. "It's hard to say. Family court judges tend to be extremely cautious. But yes, the law does usually favor biological parents, especially those without formal convictions." Out in the corridor, Paul immediately went to the room where Grace waited with the children. Lily ran to him as soon as he entered, hugging him tightly. "You were so brave," he said, kneeling to her level. "I told him you're our home now," Lily replied seriously. "I told him Mommy would want us to stay with you because you protect us." Paul felt tears threaten. "Thank you, sweetheart." "He's going to let us stay with you, right?" she asked, her big eyes full of worry. "We're doing everything we can," Paul said honestly. He couldn't promise what he wasn't sure of. Paul spent a few minutes playing with the twins, now almost 10 months old and already sitting up and trying to crawl. Sophia had her mother's smile, he realized, the same smile he'd seen in the few photos Lily kept. Michael was showing a determined personality, insisting on doing things his own way. "I'll grab some coffee," Paul finally said. "Be right back." In the deserted hallway near the coffee machines, Paul tried to organize his thoughts when he sensed a presence behind him. Turning, he found Victor Delgado standing a few feet away, watching him with a cold smile. "Mr. Mason," Delgado said in a smooth voice that contradicted the hardness in his eyes. "We finally meet properly." Paul felt his entire body tense. "We have nothing to discuss, Delgado. On the contrary," Delgado took a step forward, "I think we have a common interest." "I doubt that." "The children," Delgado went on, as though Paul hadn't spoken. "You seem attached to them." "I love them," Paul replied firmly. "Something you wouldn't understand." Delgado's smile only widened. "Love, family, and such touching concepts." He took another step. "But in the end, it all comes down to business, doesn't it? And I'm a businessman, just like you." "What are you getting at?" Paul asked, feeling a growing sense of disgust. "A mutually beneficial proposition." Delgado now spoke almost in a whisper. $5 million, transferred to an offshore account. In return, I drop all my parental rights. You keep the kids, I keep the money. Everyone walks away happy. Paul could hardly believe what he was hearing. "You're selling your own children?" Delgado shrugged. "Let's be realistic. I never wanted to be a father. When Sophie ran off, it was a relief. If it weren't for the circumstances..." He trailed off, realizing he'd said too much. "What circumstances?" Paul pressed. "What did Sophie know about you that made her run?" Delgado's gaze hardened. "That doesn't matter now. What matters is my offer, $5 million. A bargain, considering your fortune." Paul felt a wave of revulsion, followed by a sudden clarity. "You never wanted the kids. This is just extortion. Call it what you want. But think about it. The judge will likely grant me custody. The law is on my side. So either you pay and we guarantee a happy ending for everyone, or I risk my time with 3 kids who mean nothing to me." His voice carried a veiled threat that made Paul's blood run cold. "You're despicable," Paul said, barely controlling the urge to hit the man in front of him. "I'm practical," Delgado corrected. "You have until the recess ends to decide. Don't make me withdraw the offer." With that, he walked away calmly, leaving Paul shaking with rage by the coffee machine. When he returned to the waiting room, Richard immediately noticed his expression. "What happened?" Paul pulled him aside and relayed the conversation with Delgado. "That son of a..." Richard muttered. "He basically admitted he doesn't care about the kids." "Worse," Paul said. "He almost let slip something about why Sophie ran. I think she knew something incriminating, something big enough to make her fear for her life and the kids." Richard frowned, thinking, that could change everything. If we could prove he's a real threat. He was interrupted by a bailiff rushing into the room. "Mr. Barnes, the district attorney needs to speak with you immediately. It's about the Mason case." Richard shot Paul a confused look before following the bailiff. Paul stayed behind with the children, his heart pounding. What could be so urgent? Almost 20 minutes later, the door opened again. Richard entered with an expression Paul couldn't quite read, part surprise, part satisfaction. "What is it?" Paul asked, standing up. "A witness," Richard said, his voice low but intense. "Someone who worked for Delgado in Denver. She contacted the police this morning after seeing the news about the custody case in the papers. She says she saw Sophie being chased the night she fled Denver and heard Delgado give explicit orders to deal with Sophie permanently." Paul felt a wave of shock. "Which means he may have ordered her murder." "Yes. The witness is now under police protection. And there's more." Richard could hardly contain his excitement. "She brought documents, records of Delgado's illegal activities, including money laundering and trafficking. Apparently, Sophie found out about these documents and made copies before running away. That explains why he showed up so suddenly," Paul concluded. "It wasn't about the kids. It was about what Sophie might have left with them." "Exactly. The DA is reviewing the documents right now, but there's already enough to request Delgado's immediate arrest and, obviously, to suspend any custody claim." When they returned to the courtroom, the atmosphere had changed drastically. Paul immediately noticed 2 police officers positioned discreetly by the door. Delgado's lawyer was whispering nervously to his client, who wore an impassive expression but whose eyes darted around the room. Judge Collins returned to the bench, his face grimmer than before. "Ladies and gentlemen, I have received new and disturbing information that directly impacts this case. District Attorney Jenkins, please present the new details." A middle-aged man with graying hair stood from the front row. "Your Honor, the prosecution has received substantial evidence linking Mr. Victor Delgado to criminal activities, including potential involvement in the death of Sophie Campbell." A murmur spread through the courtroom. Paul looked at Delgado, who remained utterly still, only a muscle in his jaw twitching. A witness under protection provided testimony and documentation indicating that Mrs. Campbell had evidence of Mr. Delgado's illicit activities and that she fled fearing for her life and her children's, the DA said, picking up a folder. "We have phone records showing calls between Mr. Delgado and numbers associated with known criminals, made in the hours preceding Mrs. Campbell's death." Delgado's lawyer stood up. "Objection. These allegations are completely unfounded and intended solely to damage my client's image in this custody proceeding." "Mr. Green," the judge interrupted, "I'm sorry to inform you this goes far beyond a simple custody matter now. DA, please continue." "Furthermore," the DA went on, "we obtained security camera footage from a store near Mrs. Campbell's apartment, showing one of Mr. Delgado's known associates in the vicinity on the night of her death." He displayed the footage on a screen, and Paul felt a chill recognizing one of the men he'd seen with Delgado upon his arrival at court. "Based on this evidence," the DA concluded, We are requesting the immediate arrest of Mr. Delgado for investigation into the homicide of Sophie Campbell, in addition to multiple federal charges related to his criminal activities. The courtroom erupted in an uproar. The judge pounded his gavel several times until order was restored. "Officers," the judge called, "arrest Mr. Delgado." The police officers moved in at once. Delgado remained seated, still wearing a cold smile, until suddenly, in a swift move, he shoved the table and tried to bolt toward a side exit. Chaos ensued. People shouted. Officers ran after Delgado. His lawyer stood in shock. But the chase lasted only seconds before police tackled and handcuffed him. As they dragged him away, Delgado passed Paul and hissed, "This isn't over." After order was restored and Delgado removed, Judge Collins let out a deep sigh. In light of these extraordinary circumstances, this court has no choice but to immediately deny any custody request by Mr. Delgado. He looked directly at Paul. "Mr. Mason, although the normal procedure would require additional evaluations, I believe we have sufficient evidence of your capability and commitment as a guardian. Additionally, Lily Campbell's testimony was exceptionally moving and convincing." Paul could hardly breathe as the judge continued. "Therefore, it is the decision of this court to grant Mr. Paul Mason permanent legal custody of Lily, Michael, and Sophia Campbell, with the recommendation that he begin formal adoption proceedings as soon as possible." The gavel struck, finalizing the decision, and Paul felt something break inside him, not from pain but from an immense relief that was almost physical. Richard gripped his shoulder. "Congratulations, Paul. You did it." But Paul barely heard him. His eyes were on the side door that had just opened, where Grace walked in with the children. Lily looked at him, hesitant, trying to read his expression. "We won, Lily," Paul said, kneeling and opening his arms. "You're staying with me, forever." For a moment she stood still as if she couldn't believe it. Then, with a small cry, she ran to him, throwing herself into his arms so hard he almost toppled over. "Is the bad man gone?" she asked between sobs. "Yes, honey. He won't hurt anyone anymore." Lily pulled back slightly, her huge, serious eyes still brimming with tears. "Now you'll never leave us, right?" Paul felt tears he had been holding back finally escape, running freely down his face as he hugged the little girl who had changed his life. "Never, sweetheart," he answered, with all the certainty in his heart. "Never." Right there in the middle of that courtroom, surrounded by strangers but holding what was now undeniably his family, Paul Mason finally understood what it meant to have a true home. Spring had arrived in Boston, bringing with it the scent of flowers and the promise of new beginnings. 6 months had passed since the trial, since the judge had brought down the gavel and officially declared Lily, Michael, and Sophia as Paul's. 6 months of adjustments, challenges, and, surprisingly, a happiness Paul had never imagined possible. On that Saturday morning, Paul was not awakened by his phone's alarm, but by a small hand shaking his shoulder insistently. "Paul, wake up, you promised pancakes." He opened his eyes to find Lily leaning over him, already fully dressed, her hair tied back in a ponytail that was crooked, obviously done by herself. "What time is it?" he asked, fumbling for his phone on the nightstand. "Pancake time," Lily replied with the indisputable logic of a 6-year-old. Her birthday had been celebrated 3 weeks prior, turning the apartment into a sea of purple and green balloons. Paul smiled, surrendering. "Are the babies awake yet?" "Sophia she's in her crib talking to her stuffed animals. Michael's still sleeping." Talking to her stuffed animals was Lily's way of describing Sophia's increasingly elaborate babbling. At 13 months, she was already trying to form words and had her own form of communication with her toys. "Okay, soldier," Paul said, sitting up in bed. "Operation Pancakes starts in T-5 minutes. Lily flashed a triumphant grin and dashed out of the room, likely to check on the twins for the 100th time. Paul watched her go, amazed by the transformation from the frightened, wary little girl he'd first met into a growing child who was becoming more and more confident and happy. The apartment had also transformed. Paul glanced around his room, noting subtle changes. A framed drawing by Lily on the wall, a baby monitor on the nightstand, a rubber duck forgotten in the corner. His home, once styled with the impersonal precision of an interior designer, now had personality. It had life. In the kitchen, Paul prepared the pancake batter, while Lily settled Sophia into the high chair. The baby, with her curly brown hair and smile that was the exact copy of Sophie's, banged her little hands on the tray enthusiastically. "Ba Baba," she exclaimed as Paul approached. "Good morning to you too, princess," he replied, kissing the top of her head. "Where's your brother?" "Still sleeping," Lily answered, fastening a bib around Sophia's neck. "He stayed up late last night." Paul nodded. Michael was going through a rough teething phase, meaning interrupted nights for everyone. Paul never thought it was possible to function on so little sleep, yet still feel so happy. As he prepared breakfast, he watched Lily chat happily with Sophia, telling her about a school project. It seemed impossible that this was the same child who once barely spoke and eyed everyone with distrust. The child therapy Paul insisted on, despite Lily's initial reluctance, was working wonders. "Can I flip the pancake?" Lily asked, moving closer to the stove. "Sure," Paul said, lifting her so she could reach the pan. "Remember how I showed you?" One quick motion. Lily bit her lip in concentration, then, with a surprisingly deft move for a 6-year-old, flipped the pancake perfectly. "I did it," she cheered, raising her arms in victory. "You'll be a chef when you grow up," Paul laughed, setting her back on the floor. A cry came through the baby monitor, letting them know Michael was finally awake. "I'll get him," Lily volunteered immediately, racing to the twins' room before Paul could reply. He smiled as she left. Lily's dedication to her siblings hadn't diminished, but it had changed from a desperate sense of responsibility to a genuine love for them as their big sister. A few minutes later, Lily returned holding Michael's hand. He was walking unsteadily, still mastering the skill. His sleepy face and tousled dark hair reminded Paul of himself first thing in the morning, something several friends had commented on, to Paul's secret delight. "You walked here all by yourself, buddy." Paul knelt, opening his arms. Michael grinned, showing his few teeth, and with a squeal of delight, let go of Lily's hand, taking 3 wobbly steps into Paul's arms. "That's it," Paul praised, lifting him in the air. "3 more steps on your own." Lily clapped, jumping with excitement. "He's getting really good. Soon he'll be running like me." Paul felt that now familiar warmth in his chest, a feeling that defied precise naming, a blend of love, pride, and disbelief at how fortunate he was to have these 3 little ones who were now his whole world. Breakfast passed in the usual chaotic harmony that defined the Mason-Campbell family's mealtimes. Paul's official adoption wasn't finalized yet. Paperwork took time, but in his heart, they were already a complete family, surnames and all. "Remember what day it is today?" Paul asked as he wiped oatmeal from Sophia's face. Lily, who was dipping a piece of pancake in syrup, looked up. "Saturday?" "Yes, but it's a special Saturday." Paul chose his words carefully. "Remember we talked about visiting your mom?" Lily's face grew serious immediately. She nodded, putting her fork down. "At the cemetery." "That's right." Paul studied her. "But only if you're ready. If you'd rather wait, that's okay." Lily thought for a moment, her eyes showing a maturity well beyond her years. "I want to go," she decided. "I got a card for her at school yesterday. My teacher helped me write it." Paul felt a knot in his throat. "That's really sweet, Lily." After breakfast came the military operation of getting out of the house with 3 kids. Diapers, spare clothes, snacks, toys to keep the twins busy, making sure Michael's shoes were on correctly, convincing Sophia to wear a hat because of the bright sun. 2 hours later, they were finally in the car. To Paul's surprise, Lily was quiet and pensive during the drive, gazing out the window while the twins fussed over a teething toy in the back seat. "You okay?" Paul asked, looking at her in the rearview mirror. She nodded, still staring outside. "Just thinking about Mommy. Do you think she can see us from somewhere?" The question caught Paul off guard. He'd never been particularly religious, but over the last months, he'd developed a deep respect for Sophie Campbell's memory. A woman who, against all odds, had protected her children until the end. "I think so," he answered honestly. "I think moms always find a way to look after their kids, even when they can't be there physically." Lily seemed to accept this, nodding thoughtfully. The cemetery was quiet and well kept, with old trees providing pleasant shade on that spring morning. Paul had visited earlier on his own to make sure everything was in order. The simple headstone had been paid for with his money. Sophie Campbell, beloved mother, along with a small garden bench for visitors to sit. They parked, and Paul pulled the double stroller for the twins out of the trunk. It was a relatively short walk to the grave, but out of respect, he wanted the twins to be comfortable. Lily walked beside him, holding a small bouquet of daisies, Sophie's favorite, she'd said, and the card she'd made at school. She looked small and vulnerable, but took steady steps. When they reached the grave, Paul hung back a little, giving Lily some space. She approached the headstone and carefully placed the flowers at its base. "Hi, Mummy," she said, her voice clear in the cemetery's stillness. "I brought you flowers." And the babies came too. As if sensing the moment's solemnity, Michael and Sophia were unusually quiet in the stroller, watching their sister with curious eyes. "Sophia already says some words," Lily continued. "She says Baba for everything, but the therapist says she'll start talking soon. Michael's walking, but he still falls a lot." She smiled a little. "He's stubborn. You always said that." Paul felt his heart ache as he watched this small girl speaking to the mother she'd lost too soon. It was unfair, he thought, that Sophie couldn't see her children growing up. See Lily's courage and strength, Sophia's smile, Michael's first steps. "We live with Paul now," Lily went on. "He has a big apartment that overlooks the park. I have my own room, all purple and green." She paused. "He's nice, Mom. At first I didn't trust him, but now I do. He never yells, even when I spill juice on the carpet, and he always leaves a light on in the hallway at night, like you used to do." Paul hadn't realized he was crying until he felt a tear roll down his cheek. Lily noticed so many small details, so many things he'd done instinctively without realizing their impact. "I go to a new school," she went on. "I made friends there. My best friend is Emma. She has a dog named Rolly." Lily gave a tiny laugh. "It's a silly name, and right, but he's cute." She opened the card she'd made and propped it against the headstone. From where Paul stood, he couldn't see the inside, but on the cover there was a colorful drawing that seemed to show 5 people. Sophie included, he realized with a pang in his chest. "And I just wanted to say," Lily hesitated, her voice growing softer. "I wanted to say I'm not that scared anymore. Paul said the bad man will never get out of prison. He showed me in the newspaper." Indeed, Paul had shown Lily, with careful limits, the news of Victor Delgado's conviction for multiple crimes, including Sophie's murder. Lily's therapist agreed it would help her feel secure to know the man her mother feared was permanently locked away. "So, Mum," Lily concluded, her voice stronger now, "I'm okay. He takes care of us." With those simple words, Paul felt something tear open inside him. The trust packed into that statement, the responsibility it carried, the recognition that he really was looking after them, it all hit him with renewed force. After a moment of silence, Lily came back to Paul and took his hand. Wordlessly, he knelt and embraced her, feeling her small arms wrap around his neck. "I think she would have liked you," Lily whispered in his ear. "I'm sure I would have loved meeting her," Paul replied, his voice thick with emotion. "She raised the most amazing girl I've ever met." Lily pulled away, wiping a tear with her sleeve. Then, with the surprising resilience children have, she pointed to the twins. "I think Sophia's hungry. She makes that face when she wants to eat." Paul chuckled softly, recognizing the shift in topic as Lily's sign that she was ready to move on. "Then let's feed the little lady. How about that cafe by the park? They have those cookies you like." The walk back to the car felt lighter, with Lily holding the stroller bar with one hand and Paul's hand with the other. She chatted to the twins about the birds in the trees, her bright voice echoing through the peaceful cemetery. And that night, after the children were finally asleep, Paul stayed in the living room, gazing at the city lights through the window. His apartment, which he had chosen years ago mainly for the stunning view, was now almost unrecognizable. The bookshelf that once displayed costly art pieces and rare first editions was now filled with children's books, educational toys, and framed photographs. The minimalist leather sofa was covered by a colorful blanket Lily had picked out from a decor store. The sleek designer coffee table, worth more than many cars, now had cushioned corners for safety and served primarily as a surface for puzzles and board games, and he wouldn't change a thing. Paul walked down the hallway, doing his usual nighttime check. First was Lily's room. She slept clutching the teddy bear he'd given her on day 2, her hair fanned across the pillow. Her star-shaped nightlight projected galaxies on the ceiling, just as she liked. He pulled up the blanket she'd kicked off and slipped out quietly. In the twins' room, the scene was equally peaceful. Sophia slept on her stomach as usual, her angelic face turned to the side. Michael sprawled in his crib, one arm and one leg hanging through the bars, in a position that looked uncomfortable but was his favorite. Paul gently moved his limbs back, smiling when Michael mumbled something unintelligible in his sleep. Back in the living room, Paul picked up a folder from his desk. It was the official adoption paperwork, nearly complete. Only a few more bureaucratic steps remained, and then Lily, Michael, and Sophia would legally be Mason Campbell. The thought still filled him with a blend of awe and joy. If anyone had told him a year ago that his meticulously organized, career-centered life would be transformed like this, he would have laughed. Paul Mason, the focused, emotionally distant businessman, becoming the father of 3 small children. Absurd, and yet here he was, changing diapers, learning to braid Lily's hair, singing lullabies, memorizing the names of every character in the kids' favorite cartoons, and astonishingly, happier than he ever thought possible. Of course, there were challenges. Lily still had occasional nightmares, screaming in the middle of the night for her mother. Michael was incredibly stubborn, constantly testing limits. Sophia had become so attached to Paul that she cried inconsolably whenever he left, even just for work. And juggling parenthood with his career required major adjustments. He now worked mostly from home, and meetings were arranged around school and medical appointments. But every challenge, every sleepless night, every missed or postponed meeting was worth it. Worth it for Lily's smile when she learned a new word on her own. Worth it for Michael's determined expression when he tried his first steps. Worth it for Sophia's tight hug when Paul returned home. Paul poured himself a small glass of whiskey, a rare indulgence these days of parenthood, and silently toasted the memory of Sophie Campbell, a woman he never knew but owed an immeasurable debt. She had given her life to protect her children, and now those same children had given Paul something he never realized he desperately needed: a family. His phone vibrated on the table. It was Richard Barnes. "Any news?" Paul asked, answering. "I just got confirmation," Richard replied, satisfaction in his voice. "Judge Franklin will preside over the final adoption hearing. She's known for supporting permanent placement in cases like yours. It's practically certain, Paul. In 2 weeks, you'll officially be a family." Paul closed his eyes, feeling enormous relief. "Thank you, Richard, for everything." "No need to thank me. You did all the hard work. Speaking of which, how did things go today?" At the cemetery, Paul looked out the window, recalling the scene of Lily at her mother's grave. It was beautiful. Hard, but beautiful. Lily is stronger than most adults I know. "That doesn't surprise me," Richard replied. "She had 2 amazing examples." "2? Sophie and you idiot," Richard laughed. "I never thought I'd say this, but you were born to be a father, Paul." After hanging up, Paul turned back to the window, contemplating the city lights. The life he lived now was so different from the one he had planned. His luxurious penthouse, once an elegant minimalist space, had become a noisy, sometimes chaotic home. His days, once filled with business meetings and fancy dinners, were now dominated by cartoons, playgrounds, and pediatric visits. And still, he had never been happier. A small sound made him turn. Lily stood in the living room doorway, rubbing her eyes. "Everything okay, sweetheart?" he asked, setting his glass aside. "I had a dream," she said, walking over to him. "It wasn't a nightmare, it was nice." "Really? Want to tell me about it?" Lily climbed onto the couch beside him, nestling comfortably against his arm. "I dreamed about Mommy. She was in a pretty garden with lots of flowers. She said she was happy because we were happy." Paul felt his throat tighten. "That's a very nice dream. Do you think it could be true? That she's in a pretty garden?" "I'm sure of it," Paul replied, sincerely believing it in that moment. Lily yawned, cuddling closer to him. "Can I stay here a bit before going back to bed?" "Of course you can." Within minutes, she was asleep again, safe and secure at his side. Paul watched her peaceful face, marveling at the journey that had brought them here. From a chance meeting on a cold night to this new life they were building together. Tomorrow would be Sunday. They would go to the zoo, as promised. Maybe get ice cream in the park afterward. Normal, routine things that, to Paul, now represented the greatest treasure in the world. Gently, he scooped Lily into his arms and carried her back to her purple and green bedroom. As he tucked her in, she mumbled something in her sleep, a small smile on her lips. Paul knew, with a certainty he had never felt before, that he had found his place in the world, not in skyscraper offices or million-dollar deals, but here in this apartment turned home, with these 3 children who were now his whole life. He kissed Lily's forehead softly before leaving. "Good night, sweetheart," he whispered. "Tomorrow will be another wonderful day." And it would. And the day after that, and the one after that, a whole lifetime of days ahead. A family rebuilt by love and courage, ready to face the future together.